Last video, we introduced this idea of Docker, and we said that Docker makes it really easy to start up and run our different programs. We're now going to start to talk about Kubernetes. Now, as we talk about Kubernetes, we're not going to immediately see why Docker and Kubernetes are so nice together. It's not going to be immediately evident. And you might be sitting there saying at the very end of this video, wait, why do we care about Docker again? Tell me about that. Well, don't worry, all this stuff is going to become more evident in due time. For right now, let's just focus a little bit on Kubernetes and see how it solves one of those issues that we ran into a little bit earlier when we were talking about scaling our application. Okay, so first off, what is Kubernetes? Kubernetes is a tool for running a bunch of different containers together. When we make use of Kubernetes, we're going to give it some configuration files. These configuration files are going to tell Kubernetes about the different containers that we want to run in our application. Kubernetes is then going to create these containers that are going to run our programs for us, and it's going to handle communication, or essentially network requests, between all these different containers as well. So we can really imagine Kubernetes as a tool to run some different programs and make communication between those programs very easy and straightforward. Of course, just giving you a verbal definition of this or a verbal description is not super helpful, so let's take a look at a diagram and better understand what Kubernetes is all about. So with Kubernetes, we create something called a cluster. A cluster is a set of different virtual machines. It can have as few as one virtual machine, like what you see right here, or it can have many hundreds or thousands of virtual machines. All these different virtual machines we refer to as nodes. They are all managed by something called a master. Master is essentially a program that's going to manage everything inside of our cluster, all the different programs that are running, all the different aspects of these virtual machines, and many other things. We are going to tell Kubernetes to run some programs for us. When we do so, it's going to take our program and then more or less randomly assign it to be executed by one of these nodes. And again, remember, a node is really just a virtual machine. So let's take a look at what this would really look like in practice. So we are going to create some configuration files that are going to provide some very explicit directions to Kubernetes on what we want it to do. So we might write a configuration file that says, run 2 copies of our post service. And also make sure that we can very easily access these post services after they have been created. So you and I are going to write that configuration file and then feed it into this master thing. Master is going to read that configuration file and then try to implement all the steps we've written out inside there. So in this case, it's going to attempt to create 2 different copies of our post service wrapped up inside of containers. These will be randomly assigned, again, more or less randomly. There actually is some science to it, but we can imagine for right now, they will be assigned to be executed by some different virtual machines or nodes inside of our cluster. Now, in this scenario, we're kind of back in the same problem we had before, where it could potentially be really hard for something like our event bus to figure out how to reach out to, say, this copy of the post service and that post service. So the big thing that Kubernetes does for us is give us the ability to just kind of arbitrarily send requests or communicate between these different services with some kind of third-party thing that we are going to create. So in short, you can kind of imagine down here that we're going to create something inside of our cluster that we can just send requests to, and it will automatically figure out how to route requests off to the appropriate service that is running inside of our application. So for example, let's imagine that we've got a copy of the post service on node 1 or virtual machine number 1, one on number 2, and then our event bus is over here on number 3. If we were not using Kubernetes, we would have to somehow teach the event bus how to directly reach out over to this second virtual machine, and more specifically, the post service running on it. And we'd have to figure out how to do the same thing to have it reach out to this first virtual machine and the post service running on there as well. And again, as we discussed in the last couple of videos, that is not what we want to do. So instead, we will simply teach our event bus how to reach out to this very common communication channel. If we send a request off to this very common communication channel, we can then be guaranteed that it will be sent off or forwarded on to every copy of our post service. And so we don't have to worry about all these intricate connection details or stuff like that. We can simply say, make a request to this service, and Kubernetes is going to take care of everything from there. So the big reason that you and I are using Kubernetes around microservices is that it's going to make communication very easy and straightforward. It's also going to make creating services, like launching new copies and scaling the number of copies we're running, very easy and straightforward as well. Now, this whole idea of having our services communicate with each other, you might be sitting there and saying, wait, Stephen, I thought we didn't want our services to communicate directly with each other. Well, yes, remember, we are not using synchronous communication between our services, but there still are programs that ultimately do have to talk with each other inside of our microservices applications. We still need to have our services communicate with some common event bus, and we need to make sure at some point in time that our services can also communicate with, say, a database that it's being assigned to it. And having this common communication channel is going to make that process a lot easier and more straightforward. Okay, so that's just a very brief introduction to Kubernetes and why we care about it in the world of microservices. So we're going to take a pause right here and then